Korea's Hallyu, a performing art that includes dance, song as well as theatre, is the latest to be added onto UNESCO's list of Intangible Cultural Heritage, raising the total tally of the country's assets on the list to 22. So what led to Hallyu's inclusion onto the UNESCO list? What happens once a cultural asset is recognized as a heritage of humanity? And what are the ways to better promote and protect cultural heritage? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Efforts to safeguard the country's intangible cultural heritage are well underway as Korea's traditional mask dance becomes among the most recent to receive UNESCO recognition. Now, for more on this, I have Mr. Park Sang-mook at the International Information and Networking Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage in the Asia-Pacific region, I believe. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Park.
Thank you for having me on the show.
I also have Professor Koo Ji-sung at Binghamton University live on the line as well. Professor Koo, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Right, Mr. Park, we'll start here in the studio then. Let's begin with a very brief introduction then of the center that you work at.
Well, ICCAP stands for the International Information and Networking Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage in the Asia-Pacific region under the auspices of UNESCO. As one of the 8 UNESCO Category 2 centers around the world working in the field of intangible cultural heritage, which we call Living Heritage or ICH in acronym, we work with 48 Asia-Pacific UNESCO member states, especially with the government, state agencies, research institutes, NGOs, and even communities that are involved in safeguarding their ICH. To this purpose, we are running a variety of projects and activities directed towards safeguarding their ICH through 2 of our key functions that are information sharing and networking.
Right, I see. And before we delve into the specifics of today's session, Professor Koo, generally speaking, do you believe that the phenomenon of Hallyu has perhaps boosted global interest in the more traditional cultural assets of Korea as well?
Yeah, I think it certainly has. Before COVID changed everything, the number of foreign tourists to Korea was, I believe, around 14 million a year. It's difficult to determine exactly how many came to Korea as tourists for reasons directly connected to Hallyu or the global popularity of K-pop or K-dramas. But I'm certain that a significant number did so. They came to Korea to pursue their fandom in K-pop and K-dramas. But once in Korea, I think they need things to do other than just that. And certainly traditional Korean cultural assets, both contemporary and historical, are really important sites to also visit. So I sort of see K-pop and K-dramas as gateway elements that opens up the world to other elements of Korean culture. While the impetus for their interest might be BTS or now New Jeans, Squid Games or Extraordinary Attorney Woo, which are all very popular globally. But once in Korea, I think most of these tourists also end up visiting pre-modern palaces, temples, and folk villages, and etc. And lastly, here in the United States, as a professor, I have witnessed, you understand, it's a phenomenon where many foreign languages have been in decline as students are no longer taking Italian, German, and Japanese as much. Korean is a rare language that has expanded actually in popularity among students here. And these students, of course, many of them have interest in K-pop and K-dramas, but once they enroll, they're exposed to many other elements of Korean culture, especially traditional culture. And so I think this all plays together nicely that way.
Right, I see. That's good to know. Now, Mr. Park, then, based on having heard what Professor Koo has just said, tell us now a little bit more about the recent inclusion of Korea's Hallyu, the traditional mask dance, onto UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage list, please.
Oh, sure. There can be different backdrops and interpretations to the recent inscription of Hallyu on the UNESCO list, but what comes first is, of course, is compliance with the UNESCO evaluation criteria set by the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Hallyu, the Korean mass dance drama, was actually a very good candidate for nomination because because it already had a good safeguarding plan in effect with active participation of various stakeholders, including the central government, local authorities, and the communities that practice the Taichung. And this inscription basically indicates that the Taichung has become an important intangible cultural heritage of humanity, and that it helps demonstrate the diversity of ICH and raises the awareness about its importance. And it is also noteworthy that the UNESCO evaluation body particularly appreciated Taichung for its reflection of the changes in the Korean society, as well as its underlying appeal to the universal equality and the criticism of social hierarchy. That this generation continued to play a critical role in the transmission of the practice, passing on the related knowledge and skills of the Taichung performances and mass making to younger generations was also an important consideration for the evaluation body.
Right, I see. And now, Professor, on a more scholastic note then, what would you say is the importance of perhaps raising global or broader awareness about a country's cultural heritage beyond its national borders, that is?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding too cynical, I'm not sure if it's all that important in and of itself. I suppose an important question to ask is why a country would need to raise awareness about its cultural heritage in the first place. And of course, it's one thing to raise awareness among the people within your own country, but it's another thing to altogether to create, to care about wanting people of other countries to care about your country's cultural heritage. Is it cultural pride, nationalism? Is it competition? Is it motivated by economics, by potential profit in it? All of the above. And what would be the consequence if nothing was done, if we didn't make an effort to broaden the awareness of the country's cultural heritage? So I guess for me, it's a more generic philosophical question about the need for other countries to know what your country's cultural heritage is. So I think, once again, in and of itself, it's, I don't know if it's that important, but there are other elements, like I mentioned, competition, profit, national pride, and maybe those are important elements.
Right, they are actually, Professor Gu, they are. Mr. Park, you mentioned this earlier about the criteria for being included in the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. And based on that, what more can you tell us about this particular criteria? And how does it differ from the criteria needed for the Tangible Cultural Heritage list?
UNESCO evaluation body basically examines if a heritage is and will be well safeguarded based on the 5 criteria from R1 to R5. The submitted documents called nomination file should basically explain the elements compliance with the UNESCO definition of ICH, and it should also describe the impact of potential inscription and the present and future safeguarding plans and the participation of relevant communities at the national, regional, and the international levels. And if it satisfies all the 5 criteria, the evaluation body recommends to inscribe the element on the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanities. But aside from these technical explanations, I would like to ask for the particular attention to be drawn to the word safeguarding, which implies that an ICH should never be taxonomized, and that an ICH can change and evolve in the course of time as a society changes. This working mechanism is actually quite different from that of the tangible heritage, in which its value is to be preserved and protected as it was back in the days. And on that note, the post-inscription measures should also take different forms. Like, for example, countries will be asked to preserve the outstanding universal value of their tangible heritage inscribed as a World Heritage Site, but ICH is basically transmitted by human beings, and therefore it is practically out of the question to be preserved forever. And on that point, it should require active use and broader participation of the people beyond the practitioner groups to transmit such heritage to the future generations.
I see. Meanwhile, Professor Gu, how does Korea's efforts then to promote its culture perhaps compare to those of its neighbors like China and Japan?
Yeah, I was surprised to find out that Korea is number 3 on the list of number of cultural assets that's been inscribed. Number one is China with 42, France is number 2 with 23, and South Korea is number 3 with 22, tied with Japan also with 22. And in comparison, North Korea, I believe, has only 4 cultural elements. This past year, naengmyeon was inscribed. The United States has 0. So what this seems to me is that Korea is already very aggressively promoting cultural heritage, maybe much more so compared to other countries. Because Korea is not the biggest country in the world. I'm sure Korea is not number 3 in the world in terms of owning valuable assets. It's just that the UNESCO has recognized it and has inscribed it. So why is South Korea so aggressive in getting these elements recognized? Maybe that's a question that Mr. Park would be better equipped to answer. But I think compared to China and Japan, Korea is really, I think, holding its own, if not above its weight class.
Right, good to know, good to know. And before we ask Mr. Park about that question, first, Mr. Park, simply speaking then, based on what you mentioned earlier about the responsibility that follows once an asset is added onto that list, what changes, however, what changes for the asset itself once it is recognized as a global heritage?
Inscription of an ICH element on the UNESCO list basically increases the visibility and raises the awareness about the inscribed element at the national, regional, and international levels. And at the same time, not only Koreans, but also those outside Korea will instantly recognize the element labeled as the UNESCO heritage. And the element will immediately come to stand in the limelight of the local and national cultural policy, and therefore will be given more opportunities at many different levels. This also means that the element will be subject to extensive public exposure and widespread media coverage, which will eventually draw more attention from people and lead to more participation from those beyond the initial practitioner groups. In doing so, the overall safeguarding environment will be strengthened than before the inscription.
Right, I see. And Professor Gu, what more do you suppose can the government here do to bolster interest in Korea's cultural assets, do you think? I understand it's a very vague question, but essentially what participation can the government itself take to better boost these kind of efforts that Mr. Park has mentioned?
Well, I mean, in light of sort of what we've been talking about, it seems the Korean government is doing enough already. I'm not sure if any more effort is necessary or it needs to be ratcheted up. But however, you know, the preserving of cultural assets, of course, are very important. But the act of preserving implies that something is under threat. And I know maybe we'll get to later the difference between intangible and tangible cultural assets. But when it comes to tangible assets, physical structures, it's one thing to preserve them. But the question of how do you preserve intangible cultural assets is a tricky one. And I suppose getting the UNESCO to recognize some of the cultural elements is one way of doing that. But it seems to me that South Korea is doing just fine promoting its culture globally. Once again, the initial question about Hallyu, that is, I think, maybe the way it currently is, that's the gateway. But I don't know if the government needs to do anything more because the people who are interested in Korea are generating enough of their own, I think, efforts to understand and to get to know Korean assets.
Right, and staying with such efforts, Mr. Park, I understand more work is being underway right now to secure UNESCO recognition for more assets here, including makgeolli making. Now, that being said, Mr. Park, could you perhaps walk us through the entire process of securing such recognition?
My pleasure. Member states that wish to have their heritage inscribed on the UNESCO list can go through internal consultations with the relevant stakeholders to decide which heritage they will select and submit to the UNESCO for its review. And once the decision is made, they can work with relevant stakeholders once again to draft and prepare a nomination file along with the necessary dossier that explains explains every possible aspect of the target heritage in line with the prescribed evaluation criteria. Then the nomination file will be submitted to the Living Heritage entity at the UNESCO headquarters, and the Living Heritage entity will check the technical completeness of the nomination file, and if it met all the criteria, it will be directed to the evaluation body for its review. And the evaluation body are composed of 6 NGOs and 6 experts elected from UNESCO member states will review the dossier and give the recommendation to inscribe, refer, or not to inscribe the element on the UNESCO list. And this recommendation will be later reviewed once again and adopted by the Intergovernmental Committee for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage that makes important decisions for the 2003 Convention. And this is exactly when we get to see the news and media that heritage is finally inscribed on the UNESCO list. And as a final step, this decision by the committee will be later approved once again by the General Assembly of the States Parties to the 2003 Convention in the following year of the inscription.
Right, I see. And now, Professor Koo, as you mentioned, pundits have been saying the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, it's much more complex and daunting perhaps than the practice of preserving tangible assets. You agree?
Yeah, I think maybe not more complex, but perhaps they're different in the way that it's complex. As an example, I believe kimjang, the art of making kimchi, has been inscribed in South Korea since 2013. And 2 years later, North Korea also did something similar with their kimchi making tradition in 2015. And in 2013, the same year, Japan had washoku, or their traditional Japanese cuisine, inscribed. So I think there's an element of competition going on with these nations. Now, was it necessary for kimjang to be recognized in this way? The notion that the preservation, once again, assumes something of value is at risk or endangered, with kimchi, I'm not sure if that's really a factor. I don't think kimchi will ever vanish from Korea, but having the kimjang recognized, I think it points to maybe a sense of threat. And I know back in the 2013, that era, the Korean kimchi manufacturers sensed a threat from Japan and China as competitors for the kimchi global trade. And having the UN involved, both with alimentarius, when they got the kimchi recognized, it's certain formula recognized by UN, and also with UNESCO's intangible cultural products. What it points to me is not necessarily a threat of it vanishing, but rather a global competition about wanting to be recognized, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But kimchi would be popular, has become popular regardless. Right now, here in the United States and elsewhere, kimchi is all the rage. I don't know if it was necessary for the UNESCO to recognize kimjang, but the fact that it did, I think, might have also helped. And so overall, it's really, once again, a slippery thing to figure out how to preserve intangible materials as opposed to a structure like the pyramids, right?
Right, of course. And keeping in mind what Professor Koo has said, Mr. Park, how do you evaluate Korea's efforts to overall better promote and perhaps effectively protect its intangible cultural heritage?
Well, Korea has always taken preemptive measures when it comes to cultural heritage management. Considering that Korea already had its own institutional framework for ICH safeguarding since early 1960s, and that the UNESCO adopted a Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage only after 2003, it is not really difficult to assume how progressive Korea has been in its cultural heritage management. And as far as ICH is concerned, Korea is actually considered as one of the most pioneering countries, having introduced some of the important ICH policies, such as Living Human Treasures program to the International Society in 1993. But Korea really didn't settle for the present. With the adoption of the 2003 Convention, Korea separated ICH from the existing Cultural Heritage Protection Act and enacted independent laws and regulations for ICH safeguarding in 2015. And by embracing these these global trends, Korea has constantly responded to the changes in the Ice Age safeguarding environment and continue to take the lead in global Ice Age policy. It is also noticeable that Korea has served multiple times as a member of the Intergovernmental Committee that makes important decisions for the Ice Age in general, including at the 17th session that was held back in last November in Rabat, the capital city of Morocco.
Right, I see. Beyond our intangible heritage, Professor Koo, some fear that the granting of global recognition to certain assets, especially global heritage sites, may serve to perhaps challenge efforts to preserve them as many people continue to seek them out. How do you respond?
Yeah, once again, I think the difference between tangible and intangible comes into play. I've heard frequently, since I am very interested in K-pop as an academic sort of subject, early on, a lot of people thought the K-pop was not Korean at all. I think that idea has changed. And I can see in the future people wanting to sort of preserve K-pop once it becomes something quite different. I can see in the future maybe some digital heritage when it comes to South Korea and virtual heritage being preserved. So when you talk about those items being preserved, it's quite different from, I think, once again, these structures. I believe there are two cultural heritage lists. One is regular list that Korea, once again, is number 3 on. But there is another list, there's much shorter global list of items that are in need of urgent safeguarding. And nothing that is Korean is on that list yet. So maybe when the time comes, we will have some Korean elements in the urgent safeguarding category as well. But when it comes to, I think, cultural intangible elements, I don't really see much threat other than some people might think that things become too watered down. If kimchi becomes too global, maybe the kimchi that's made by other people, other countries, won't be recognized as such by Koreans. Is that a good thing, bad thing? Are we talking about cultural appropriation? So there are a lot of questions that come up, and I think the positive part about the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage question is that it brings these questions up for us to debate, which I really appreciate.
Right. Mr. Park, what do you propose then to better safeguard our cultural assets? Is there anything more to be done?
Well, there can be a lot of scenarios, obviously, but the key to the better safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage would lie in the extensive participation of people beyond the communities that practice the Ice Age already. In the wake of industrialization and globalization, our cultural heritage is disappearing at an unprecedented pace, and this is because we keep losing the practitioners. We need an ecosystem where the practitioners can sustain themselves through practicing their cultural heritage. And there should also be the people that can consume the heritage and provide economic motivation for the future practitioners. To make it possible, people should start understanding that a cultural heritage has values in the modern context, and there should also be the initiatives undertaken to enhance the visibility and awareness about the cultural heritage among the public. But there's no golden rule or like a panacea, but they can take actually different forms of programs and activities ranging from exhibitions and education to digital content and networking opportunities. And once a virtual cycle structure is ready, I believe that we can see a big stride forward in safeguarding our cultural heritage.
Right, and hopefully you're right then. Mr. Park, we have like about 30 seconds left, and perhaps I could ask you the question that Professor Koo was wondering.
Sure.
Why is it that Korea seems so dedicated to preserving its culture compared to countries like the US, which Professor Koo said had none on the intangible cultural heritage list? A very short response, 20 seconds.
Okay. Korea has been like one of the most pioneering countries, just like I said before, but it is not actually limited to the intangible cultural heritage, but also to the tangible and the other areas. And this may not be really enough, I mean, for me to give all my answers in 20 seconds, but probably we can do it, yeah, for the next time.
Right, hopefully. I'll keep my fingers crossed for that. All right then, Mr. Park, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Koo, over in the US, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. To join us again same time tomorrow for a check on Korea's health. Thank you for now.